The text from my mother arrived at 6:14 a.m. on the morning of my wedding. I was already awake. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the rental cottage with my grandmother's pearl earrings in a small dish in front of me and a cup of tea I had not yet drunk. The sun was coming up over the orchard behind the cottage, and the light was the color of weak honey. The dress was hanging on the closet door in the bedroom, and my shoes were lined up beside it, and my bouquet was in a mason jar of water on the counter because the florist had told me to keep it cold. The phone buzzed once. I picked it up. "Edith, sweetheart, we changed plans. The Hollowfield venue is going to Marin instead. You'll understand. Dad and I will explain at brunch. Wear something nice." I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked at the orchard. A cardinal landed on the fence post and sat for a long second and flew off. I picked up my tea. It had gone cold. Welcome back to Broken Relations. If you are new here, we tell stories about families, the quiet ones, the ones that hurt, and the ones who finally stop apologizing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe. Let me take you back. My name is Edith Marrow. I am 31 years old. My sister Marin is 28. My parents are Dean and Lorraine Marrow, and they have spent 28 years looking at her and looking past me, and the morning of my wedding was simply the day they finally said it out loud. I should explain about the venue. The Hollowfield was a working flower farm in the next county over. The owner was a woman named Constance Bellamy, who was 71 years old and ran the place by herself with a Bernese mountain dog named Pickle and a part-time bookkeeper. The farm had a barn from 1908 that Constance had restored herself, and a meadow that flowered in late June, and a long table under a row of sugar maples where you could seat 80 people and watch the sun go down behind the hayfield. I had been visiting the farm since I was 14. My grandmother had brought me the first time. My grandmother had known Constance from a quilting circle that no longer existed in a town that was barely on the map. When my grandmother died, I kept driving out. I helped Constance with the website. I helped her organize the bookings the year her hip was bad. I had been visiting the Hollowfield for 17 years before I ever thought of getting married there. I paid for the venue myself. I want to be very clear about that because what happened next depends on it. I paid the deposit in October of the previous year. I paid the balance in March. The contract was in my name. The receipts were in a folder in my desk at home, scanned and backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts, because I am a person who keeps receipts. I have always been a person who keeps receipts. My mother used to laugh about it. Edith and her little folders, she would say, like a tiny accountant. The funny thing about being raised invisible is that you learn to keep records, not because you are paranoid, because you have learned that what you remember and what other people remember are going to be very different stories. And you would like to have at least one piece of paper on your side. Marin had been engaged for 6 months. She had gotten engaged in January, which was 4 months after I had gotten engaged, and 3 months after I had announced the venue at a family dinner. She had gotten engaged at a ski resort in Vermont, and her fiancé, Brody, was a man my parents adored because he worked in finance and called my father Sir without irony. She had been planning a winter wedding. Then in May, she had decided she wanted a summer wedding. Then in June, 2 weeks before my date, she had decided she wanted my date. Nobody had told me that part. I figured it out at 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in a rental cottage that smelt like cedar and lavender and somebody else's vacation. I picked up the phone. I scrolled to my contacts. I called my fiancé. His name was Theo. He had stayed in town the night before because we are not superstitious, but my mother is, and she had made enough comments that we had decided it was easier to humor her than to argue. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was sleep rough. "Hey, beautiful." "Theo, my mother just texted me. They gave the venue to Marin." A pause. The pause of a man calibrating whether his fiancée is making a joke. Then the pause of a man understanding that she is not. "Read it to me." I read it to him. I read it twice. He was quiet on the other end. I could hear him breathing. Theo is a high school history teacher. He is a calm man. He has the kind of patience that comes from spending his weekdays explaining the Treaty of Versailles to 15-year-olds. "Edith, that's not possible. The contract is in your name." "I know." "Are you going to call Constance?" "I'm going to drive there." "Now?" "Now." "I'll meet you." "No, stay where you are. I'll call you from the road." I hung up. I stood up. I walked to the bedroom. The dress was hanging on the closet door. It was simple, ivory, tea-length, with a square neckline and 3/4 sleeves. My grandmother had worn a dress almost exactly like it in 1962. I had not bought it because of that. I had bought it because it was the only dress in the shop that had not made me feel like a costumed version of myself. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen and pulled my purse off the back of the chair and put on my shoes, the ones I had been breaking in for 3 weeks, and I walked out the door. The drive to the hollow field was 41 minutes. I made it in 33. The sun was up by the time I turned onto the gravel road that led up to the barn. The hayfield was full of light. The sugar maples threw long shadows toward the meadow. There were 2 trucks in the gravel lot. One was Constance's old red Ford. The other was a white catering van I did not recognize. I parked, I got out, I walked toward the barn. Constance was on the porch in her work jeans and a long-sleeve shirt the color of butter. She had her reading glasses pushed up on her head and her bookkeeper's clipboard under one arm. Pickle was at her feet, gnawing on a stick that was much too large for him to actually eat. Constance saw me and her face did something complicated. Relief, then concern, then a third thing I did not have a name for. "Edith, honey, what time is it?" "It's 7:08, Constance." "You're not supposed to be here until 2. "I know. Is there a catering van here that isn't mine?" She looked at the van. She looked back at me. She set the clipboard down on the porch rail. "Sweetheart, your mother called yesterday afternoon. She said you'd had a family emergency. She said the wedding had to be moved up 2 hours and there was a change in the wedding party. She gave me a credit card over the phone for the additional fees. I tried to call you. It went to voicemail." I took my phone out of my purse. I had it on Do Not Disturb. I had set it the night before so that I would sleep. There were 14 missed calls from Constance from yesterday afternoon and evening. There were 6 from my mother. There were 2 from Marin, which surprised me because Marin had not voluntarily called me in 2 years. I had not seen any of it because the only person whose calls I had let through was Theo. I looked back at Constance. "Constance, there is no family emergency. The wedding starts at 2. There is no change in the wedding party." She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them again, her face had gone hard in a way I had never seen on her before. "Edith, I am so sorry. I should have driven over." "It is not your fault." "It is going to be my fault if I do not fix it. Tell me what is happening." I told her. I told her about the text message. I told her about Marin's wedding date being moved. I told her about the credit card, which was almost certainly my mother's, because my mother would not have used my father's, because my father did not know. My father almost never knew about the things my mother did until they were already done. Constance listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she walked off the porch and over to the catering van. She knocked on the window. A woman rolled the window down. Constance said something I could not hear. The woman said something back. Constance said something else. The woman got out of the van and went around to the back and started unloading boxes onto the gravel. Constance walked back over to me. "That's the caterer your mother hired. She's a friend of my niece. I told her there's been a misunderstanding and she's loading the food back up. She is not going to charge for the trip. She is a good woman." "Thank you, Constance." "Edith, the contract for today is in your name. I have it inside in the file box. I have not changed a single line of it. Whatever your mother told me on the phone yesterday, that is not the contract. The contract is what is on paper, and the paper says you and Theo at 2:00 with 80 seats and the cake on the back table and the white peonies in the buckets by the gate. That is what is happening here today." I started to cry, not loudly, just a tear that ran down one cheek and stopped. "Edith, honey, sit down for 1 second. I am going to make you tea, and then we are going to make a couple of phone calls." I sat down on the porch step. Pickle came over and put his enormous head in my lap. Constance went inside and put the kettle on. I called Theo. I told him what had happened. He listened. He did not say much. When I was done, he said, "I am bringing your dress. I am bringing the rings. I am bringing my mother. I am bringing your shoes that are not the ones you are breaking in. The better ones, the ones in the box on the dresser. We are getting married at 2. Are you with me?" "I am with you." "Good. Now what do you want to do about your parents?" I thought about that for a long time. Pickle was breathing slow against my leg. The sun was warm on the back of my neck. I could smell the meadow. I could smell coffee from inside the barn. I could smell something else. The smell of a decision I had been putting off for 28 years. "Theo, I want to call my lawyer." "Okay." "And I want to call my parents back." "Okay." "In that order." "Edith?" "Yes." "I love you. I'll see you at 2. I hung up. Constance came out with 2 mugs of tea. She set one beside me on the porch step. She sat down on the other end of the step and looked out at the meadow. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart." If you have ever sat on a porch step on a morning that was supposed to be the best morning of your life and instead become the morning you stop pretending, then you know what that quiet feels like. If this is hitting close, drop a comment. Tell me. Let's keep going. My lawyer's name was Hadley Strauss. She was 44 years old. She had been my lawyer for 3 years, ever since the contract dispute with my old employer that I do not have time to get into here. Hadley was the kind of lawyer who did not waste your money. She would tell you in 30 seconds if you had a case. She would tell you in 3 minutes what to do about it. I had her cell phone number because she had given it to me at the end of that first contract dispute and said, if anything ever happens, call me first. I called her at 7:42 on a Saturday morning. She picked up on the third ring. Edith, you are getting married today. Why are you calling me? Hadley, I need 11 minutes. Talk. I talked. I told her everything. The text message, the venue, the contract, the catering van, the phone call my mother had made to Constance, the credit card. Hadley listened. I could hear her moving. I could hear a coffee maker. I could hear a child somewhere in the background. She did not interrupt me once. When I finished, she was quiet for a 4 count. Edith, the contract is in your name. Your mother has no authority to alter it. Misrepresenting the situation to the venue owner in order to redirect a contracted service to a different party is, depending on jurisdiction, somewhere between fraud and tortious interference. The credit card is more interesting. If your mother is using a card to pay venue change fees, that is her money being spent on her own attempt at fraud, which is a problem for her, not for you. Constance does not need to refund anything. She rendered no service. What do you want? I want my wedding. You're going to have your wedding. I want my parents to stop. Stop what? Stop all of it. The pattern, the thing they have been doing since I was 4. Hadley was quiet for another 4 count. Edith, I cannot make your parents stop being who they are. I can make this specific incident expensive enough that they think twice. Do you want me to send them a letter? Yes. Detailing? Detailing the contract. Detailing the misrepresentation. Detailing the consequences if they continue. Today? Monday. Monday is fine. Monday is better. Today is your wedding. Edith, listen to me. Do not engage with them today. Do not call them back. Do not respond to the text. Do not let them in the gate. If they show up, Constance can call the sheriff. She has the right. The contract is yours. Today is yours. Do you understand? I understand. Good. Send me a screenshot of the text when we hang up. Send me your parents' phone numbers. Send me the venue contract. I have everything else from the prenup work. I will draft the letter today and send it Monday morning. Edith. Yes. Get married. Have a beautiful day. Call me Tuesday. Hadley. Yes. Thank you. You're going to be fine. I hung up. Constance was looking at me. Was that your lawyer? Yes. She sounds like a person who knows what she's doing. She does. Good. Now what? Now I am going to call my parents. Constance raised one eyebrow. She did not say anything. She just sipped her tea and waited. I want you to understand something about my parents before I tell you what I said on that phone call. They were not bad people in the way that bad people are bad in movies. They were bad people in the way that ordinary people are bad. They were the kind of bad that comes from never being told no and never being asked why. My father, Dean, had been a regional manager at an insurance company for 32 years. He was a man who believed in efficiency. He believed in the path of least resistance. If my mother said something, he agreed with it, because agreeing was easier than disagreeing, and because in 35 years of marriage, he had learned that disagreeing cost him things he was not willing to pay for. My mother, Lorraine, had run a small interior design business for 2 decades, and she was good at it because she had a particular kind of taste, and she was also good at convincing people that her taste was their taste. She had run our family the same way. She had an idea of how things should look. Marin fit the picture. I did not. I was the older daughter. I was the one who looked too much like my father's mother, who my mother had not gotten along with. I was the one who read too many books and had opinions about them. I was the one who at 11 had said at a dinner party that I did not want to wear the dress my mother had bought me and had been called sullen and difficult for 2 years afterward. Marin was the younger daughter. Marin was a long-limbed blonde child with a laugh that adults found charming. Marin had been the prettier baby, the easier toddler, the more photogenic flower girl. By the time I was 8, the family album had 3 pictures of me and 47 of Marin. I am not exaggerating. I counted once. I was 12. I counted because I wanted to know if I was making it up. I was not making it up. I called my mother's cell. She picked up on the first ring. She had been waiting.
Edith, sweetheart, I am so glad you called. Are you on your way? On my way where, Mom? To brunch. We have brunch at the club at 9. Your father has the reservation. Mom, I am not coming to brunch. Edith, please don't be difficult. Your sister has been under so much stress. You know how Brody's family is. We just thought, given everything, given that your situation is more flexible. My situation is that I'm getting married today at 2 o'clock at the Hollow Field, just like the contract says, just like the invitation said, just like every conversation we have had since October. A pause, a long one. Edith, we have already moved everything. Marin's florist is on the way. The photographer has been notified. You will need to unnotify them. Edith, Mom, I am at the Hollow Field right now. I have been here since 7. The catering van you sent has been turned around. Constance, who has owned this farm since before Marin was born, has confirmed that the contract is in my name and that the only wedding happening here today is mine. My lawyer has been informed. There will be a letter on Monday. I am asking you one time to not come. Not today. I could hear her breathing. I could hear my father in the background asking what was happening. I could hear Marin's voice further away, sharper, saying something I could not make out. Edith, you cannot do this to your sister. Mom, listen to what you just said. What do you mean? You said I cannot do this to my sister. I am getting married. On the day I planned, at the place I paid for, to the man I love. And you said I cannot do this to her. Edith, I am not doing anything to her. I am doing something for myself. There is a difference. You have spent 28 years pretending there isn't. Edith Eleanor Marrow. Do not come to the venue, Mom. If you come, Constance will call the sheriff, and you will be turned away in front of the catering staff and the photographer and the florist. I do not want that for you. I am asking, please do not come. Your father is not going to stand for this. My father is going to do what you tell him to do. He always has. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. I will not be at brunch. I will be getting married. I love you. Goodbye. I hung up. My hand was shaking. Not a lot, just a little.
Constance reached over and put her hand on top of mine. Pickle made a long, contented sigh against my leg. The sun moved a little higher over the meadow. Edith, sweetheart. Yes? I have run this farm for 23 years. I have hosted 312 weddings. You are the calmest bride I have ever had the privilege of watching this morning. I want you to know that. I do not feel calm, Constance. That is the thing about calm. It does not feel like anything. That is how you know. If you have ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved on a morning that was supposed to belong to joy, you know what the inside of that quiet feels like. If you are still here, hit subscribe. There is more. Theo arrived at 9:30 with the dress in a garment bag and the rings in a small velvet pouch in his jacket pocket, and his mother in the passenger seat with a thermos of coffee and a tin of shortbread. Theo's mother was named Iris. She was 64 years old, a retired pediatric nurse, and she had loved me since the first dinner I had at her house, the one where I had refilled her water glass without being asked. Iris had a way of making things small and manageable. She had a way of looking at a problem and dividing it into the parts that were hers to fix and the parts that were not. Theo had inherited this from her. His father had died when he was 19, and Iris had raised him through college on a nurse's salary and a kind of unbreakable practical love that I had never seen in my own family. Iris took one look at me on the porch and walked over and hugged me. She did not ask what had happened. She just held on for a long second, and then she let go and she said, "You eat one of these now or I will be insulted." She handed me a piece of shortbread. I ate it. It was buttery and thick and tasted like a kitchen I had never grown up in. Theo set the garment bag on the porch rail. He looked at me. His eyes were a little red. He had been driving with the windows down. "Edith. Hi. How are you?" "I am okay." "Are you sure?" "I am sure. I called my lawyer. I called my mother. I told my mother not to come." Theo was quiet for a second. "How did that go?" "It went the way I needed it to go. Whether it went the way she needed it to go is not my problem." He smiled. It was a small smile, the corners only. "Okay." Iris put her hand on my shoulder. "Honey, where is your makeup? Where is your hair person? What time is your photographer coming?" "My makeup is in the cottage. My hair person is meeting me at noon. My photographer is meeting me at 1. "Right. Theo, you are going back to the cottage to get her makeup. Constance, may I borrow your kitchen for a moment? Edith, you are going to come inside with me, and you are going to drink a glass of water and eat something that is not shortbread, and then we are going to start your day over." I looked at Iris. I looked at Theo. I looked at Constance. "Yes," I said. "Let's start over." There were 47 missed calls on my phone by 11. I did not answer any of them. My father called 8 times. My mother called 19. Marin called 4. Brody called twice, which was strange because Brody had never called me before. There were texts. I did not read them. At 11:15, my mother sent a long voice memo. I did not listen to it. I deleted it. At 11:42, my Aunt Constance, different Constance, my mother's sister, who lived in the next state and who I had not seen in 2 years, sent me a single text. It said, "Edith, I am on a plane. I land at 12:15. I am coming. I love you." I read it twice. I sat down on the bench in the dressing room of the barn. The dressing room was a small room Constance Bellamy had built into the loft of the barn, with a window that overlooked the meadow, and a long mirror, and a rack for the dress, and a chair for the maid of honor. I had no maid of honor. I had a friend named Naomi who was reading a poem during the ceremony and who was driving up from the city, but I had not picked a maid of honor because the truth was that I had been planning this wedding mostly alone, because Marin had refused to be in it, and because I had not had a sister to be in it with me. I had not minded. I had told myself I had not minded. I had built the ceremony around the idea that I had not minded. I read my Aunt Constance's text again. Aunt Constance was my mother's older sister. She was 57. She had moved to a different state when I was 16, after a fight with my mother that I had never fully understood. She had sent me a graduation card every year. She had sent me a card on my 18th birthday that had a photo inside of her holding me when I was a baby. And on the back, in her handwriting, "You were such a serious little person. I always liked that about you." I had kept the card. It was in a box in my apartment. I had not seen Aunt Constance in person since I was 14. I texted her back. "I am at the hollow field. Constance Bellamy is the owner. Come straight to the barn." She responded immediately. "Tell me what happened." I told her in 3 sentences. She read them. The dots appeared. Then they went away. Then they came back. "I am on the plane right now. I will be there by 1:30. I have something to tell you that I should have told you 13 years ago. I love you, sweetheart." I put the phone down. I looked at my dress on the hanger. I looked at the meadow through the loft window. The peonies in the buckets by the gate were the color of a peach when you cut it open. I thought about Aunt Constance on a plane, somewhere over the Midwest, coming to a wedding she had not been invited to because she had figured out, somehow, that I needed her. I thought about Iris downstairs, helping Constance Bellamy set up the chairs. I thought about Theo, who had driven all the way back to the cottage for my makeup bag, and was probably now driving back with my better shoes that I had forgotten in the box on the dresser. I thought about my mother, who was probably in her car right now, deciding whether or not to come. I picked up the phone one more time. I called Hadley Strauss. She picked up on the first ring. "Edith." "Hadley, my aunt is coming. She is on a plane. She says she has something to tell me that she should have told me 13 years ago." A pause. "Edith, do you know what she is going to tell you?" "No." "Do you want me to guess?" "Hadley, it is going to be about your mother. It is going to be about something your mother did or said about you when you were a child that explains why your mother is the way she is. It is going to be a piece of information that is going to feel like it explains a lot. Edith, listen to me. Whatever she tells you, it does not have to change today. You can hear it and put it in a drawer until tomorrow. Today is your wedding. Tomorrow is forever. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good. Get married. Call me Tuesday." She hung up. The hairstylist arrived at 12. Her name was Penelope, and she was 26, and she had a tattoo of a fern on her forearm. And she did my hair in 47 minutes, mostly in silence, which was exactly what I needed. The makeup artist arrived at 12:30. She was Penelope's friend. Her name was Quinton. She did my makeup in 31 minutes, also mostly in silence. By 1:15, I was in the dress and the better shoes and my grandmother's pearl earrings and a small spray of rosemary in my hair that Iris had tucked in at the last second, because Iris had said, It's an old custom. It means remembrance. Your grandmother would have wanted it. I had not told Iris about my grandmother. Iris had simply known. At 1:23, Aunt Constance walked into the loft. She was wearing a navy blue dress and flat shoes, and her hair was shorter than the last time I had seen her. And she was older than I remembered. And she stopped in the doorway and looked at me, and her hand went up to her mouth, and she said, "Oh, Edith, oh, sweetheart, look at you." I started to cry. Not the makeup ruining kind, just the small kind. I crossed the loft. She held me. She held me for a long time. She smelled like airport coffee and a perfume I half remembered. When she let go, she held my face in both her hands.
Your grandmother would be so proud. Aunt Constance.
Yes?
What do you have to tell me?
She closed her eyes for a second, then she opened them. Not today. Hadley is right. You know Hadley. Hadley is my friend's daughter. She is the one who told me to come. She called me at 8 this morning. Edith, I am not here to tell you anything today. I am here to walk you down the aisle if you want me to, or to sit in the front row, or to do whatever you need. Tomorrow, I will tell you everything. Today, I will just be here. Aunt Constance. Yes. Walk me down the aisle. She started to cry. Quietly, she nodded. She squeezed my hands. Yes, sweetheart. Yes. Hadley had called my aunt at 8 in the morning. Hadley had called my aunt before she had called me back about the letter. Hadley had known. Hadley had been planning. Hadley was the kind of lawyer who built scaffolding around her clients without asking, because she knew her clients did not always know what to ask for. I have thought about this 100 times since. I have thought about how the right people in the right places at the right hours can pick up a phone and the architecture of someone else's worst day starts to bend a little. The ceremony was at 2. There were 78 people in the chairs. My parents were not among them. Marin was not among them. Brody was not among them. The chair my mother would have sat in was empty, but Iris had put a small spray of peonies on it, because Iris had said, "Empty chairs at a wedding bother me." Beside it, in the chair my father would have sat in, there was nothing. Aunt Constance walked me down the aisle through the meadow, between the rows of chairs, in the late afternoon light, with the sugar maples throwing long green shadows on the grass, and the peonies in the buckets by the gate breathing out their summer smell. Theo was standing at the end of the aisle in a navy suit. His face when he saw me was the face I will remember on my deathbed. The ceremony was 22 minutes long. The officiant was a friend of Theo's from college. Naomi read a poem by Mary Oliver. Theo and I had written our own vows. I will not put my vows in here. They were mine. I will say only that one of the lines was, "I promise to be the kind of family you have already taught me family can be." I said it to Theo. I meant it. I meant it for him, and I meant it for Iris, and I meant it for Aunt Constance in the front row crying into a tissue, and I meant it for Constance Bellamy in the back row holding Pickle on a leash, and I meant it for Hadley Strauss, who I had never met in person and who was somewhere in the city right now, drafting a letter that would go in the mail Monday morning. The reception was 4 hours. We ate, we danced, The cake was a simple 2-tier with white icing and a small cluster of fresh peonies on top. Naomi caught the bouquet, which she had not intended to because she was tying her shoe.
Iris and Aunt Constance sat next to each other at dinner and talked in a way that suggested they had known each other in a previous life and were just remembering. At 8:30, the sun was going down. The light over the hayfield was the color of copper. Theo and I stepped away from the dancing and walked out to the gate where the peonies had been that morning. They were mostly gone now. Guests had taken them, the way Constance Bellamy always told her brides to let them. The buckets were almost empty. The meadow had gone quiet. Theo took my hand. "Edith?" "Yes?" "Are you okay?" "I am okay." "Are you sad?" "I am not sad. I am something else. I do not have a name for it yet." He nodded. He did not push. That is one of the things I love most about him. He has never pushed. "Theo?" "Yes." "They are going to call tomorrow, or Monday, or both. They are going to ask if we can have brunch and pretend none of this happened. My mother is going to cry. My father is going to be embarrassed. Marin is going to act like she does not know what I am talking about. Probably. I am not going to pretend. I know. I want you to know that. I want you to know that this is not me overreacting on a hard morning. I am not going to forget this. I am not going to put it in a drawer. I am going to remember every single thing about today and every single thing about who showed up, and I am going to live the rest of my life accordingly." He squeezed my hand. He did not say anything for a long second. Then he said, "Edith, I have been waiting for this version of you for 9 years. You have known me 9 years. That is what I am saying." I laughed, not loud, just enough. We walked back toward the barn. The lights had come on inside, strung between the rafters, the small white kind that Constance Bellamy had bought herself in a hardware store in 2009 and had never had to replace. The music was something slow. Iris was dancing with Aunt Constance. Naomi was talking to the officiant. Pickle was asleep under the cake table. I want to pause here for a second. If you have ever watched the people who showed up move around a room without the people who didn't, then you understand what I felt walking back into that barn. If this story is reaching you, share it with someone who needs it. The aftermath was slower than the morning. It always is. The morning of a hard thing is loud. The aftermath is quiet. The aftermath is months. My mother called me at 9:14 on Monday morning. I did not pick up. She left a voicemail. I deleted it without listening. Hadley's letter went out at 11. It was 3 pages. It detailed the contract. It detailed the misrepresentation made to Constance Bellamy. It detailed the consequences of any further interference, which included a civil suit for tortious interference, the seeking of damages for emotional distress, and a permanent record of the incident that would be filed in our family attorney's records and made available to any future estate proceedings. The last paragraph said, Ms. Marrow has no obligation to maintain a relationship with parties who attempt to fraudulently divert her contracted services to a third party. Future communication regarding this matter should go through this office. My mother received the letter on Tuesday.
She called Hadley's office on Tuesday afternoon. Hadley did not take the call. Hadley sent a follow-up letter on Wednesday confirming that all communication regarding this matter would be in writing. My father called me on Thursday from his office. I picked up because it was a different number. He said, "Edith, this has gotten out of hand." I said, "Dad, I love you. I am not interested in your version of how this got out of hand. If you want to talk to me, you can talk to me without your wife in the room. I am not available for any conversation that includes her until she has done some work on what she did. I am sorry. I love you. Goodbye." I hung up. He did not call back for 6 weeks. Marin sent me a text 2 weeks after the wedding. It said, "I hope you're happy." I did not respond. Brody sent me an email 3 weeks after the wedding. The subject line was, "I am sorry." The body of the email said, "Edith, I had no idea what your mother was doing. Marin told me on Sunday. I broke off the engagement on Monday. I do not know if that matters to you, but I wanted you to know. Brody." I read it twice. I sent him a 1-line reply. "Brody, thank you for telling me. Take care of yourself." He did not respond. I do not know what happened to him. I hope he is well. Aunt Constance came to my apartment on the Sunday after the wedding. She brought a bottle of wine and a small wooden box. She sat on my couch. She told me what she had been waiting 13 years to tell me. The thing she told me was that when I was 4 years old, my mother had told her in a kitchen in front of an open refrigerator that she had not wanted a second child after Marin, that Marin had been the child she had always pictured, and that I had been a mistake she had spent 4 years trying to forgive me for. Aunt Constance had told my mother that she was being cruel. My mother had told Aunt Constance to mind her own business. My mother had not spoken to Aunt Constance for 3 years afterward, except at Christmas, and only in front of other people. Aunt Constance had carried that conversation for 27 years. She had not known how to give it to me. She had been waiting for the day I might be able to hear it. I sat with the information. I did not cry. I felt instead something settle in me that had been moving around my whole life. I had spent 31 years trying to figure out what I had done. The answer was that I had not done anything. I had been born into a story my mother had already decided not to tell. I thanked Aunt Constance. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I was glad she had finally told me. We drank the wine. She slept on my couch. In the morning, she made me eggs. Theo and I bought a small house in the fall. It was 30 minutes from Iris and 90 minutes from Aunt Constance. I planted peonies along the fence line that October. They did not bloom the first year. They did not bloom the second year. They bloomed the third year. They were the color of a peach when you cut it open. A year and 2 months after the wedding, my father called me. He called from a different number than the office. He called from his cell. He said, "Edith, I have left your mother. I am living in an apartment. I would like to see you. I do not expect anything. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for a cup of coffee." I looked out the kitchen window of our small house. The peonies had not yet bloomed that year because it was still April. The light was the color of weak honey, the same color as the morning of my wedding. Theo was reading the paper at the table. Iris was coming for dinner. I said, "Dad, there is a coffee shop on Walnut Street. I will meet you there on Saturday at 10. He said, "Edith, thank you." I said, "Dad?" "Yes." "This is 1 cup. We will see what comes after." "That is fair." "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart." I hung up. I sat at the table. Theo looked over the top of the paper. He did not ask. He never pushed. I said, "He left her." Theo said, "How are you?" I said, "I am okay." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I am sure." I am going to stop the story there. I am going to stop it in a kitchen on a Tuesday in April with the light coming in low and a cup of coffee that had not yet been made and a husband who did not push and a mother-in-law on her way over and a row of peonies that would bloom in 2 months. I am going to stop it there because that is where I am now. I do not know what the next chapter is. I do not know if I will see my mother again. I do not know if my sister will ever speak to me again. I do not know if my father and I will rebuild something. I know only this. I got married on a Saturday in June. I planned a wedding for a year. My mother tried to take it from me at 6:14 on the morning of. She did not take it. I had it. I have it still. The people who showed up, showed up. The people who did not, did not. That is the whole sentence. I have spent 31 years trying to write a longer one. I do not need to anymore. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me about the day you stopped pretending. Tell me about the person who picked up the phone for you at 8 in the morning when you needed them. Tell me about the chair in your life that has been empty and what you have learned to put on it. I read every comment. I mean that. If you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them. There are more stories like this one on this channel. The link is in the description. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.